Good evening. If people could get settled. Excuse me. First, I want to thank everybody for coming out on this beautiful evening. Teaching economics, the opportunity cost of being here was quite high since you're not able to enjoy this great weather. But hopefully you will enjoy our discussion. This is our annual Handel Family Endowed Chair Lecture Series. My name is Miko Manor, and I have the honor of being the chair this year. The Handel Family Endowed Faculty Chair to perpetuate the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt was established by Shirley and Bern Handel with the hope of keeping alive the legacy of the Roosevelts in their home community and beyond. Happily, where are they? There they are. Happily, Shirley and Bern are here tonight. I want to thank you for your work and generosity in allowing us to do this and perpetuating the legacy of the Roosevelts and keeping the history of our local community alive. So, Shirley and Bern, if you'd be willing to stand briefly so everyone can thank you. I would also like to thank Trish Prunty and the Dutchess Community College Foundation, Dr. David Conklin, President of Dutchess Community College, for their ongoing support for events such as this one. Now, before introducing our speaker, I want to mention that right after her talk, there will be a short question and answer period. I ask everyone, please, if at all possible, stay until after the question and answer period is over, because it becomes very disruptive if people get up during that. And this is especially true for my students. I will be watching, okay? Now, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Kim Phillips Fein as our speaker for this evening. Of the many aspects of the legacy of the Roosevelts, perhaps none is better known than the social and economic policies of the New Deal. Tonight, Professor Phillips Fein's lecture is entitled The Long Reaction, the Transformation of American Politics and the Backlash Against the New Deal. This talk and her critically acclaimed book on the topic, Invisible Hands, The Making of the Conservative Movement from the New Deal to Reagan, relates as much to the last presidential election and to today's political discourse as it does to the years between Roosevelt and Reagan. After the question and answer period, when the lecture is over, there will be the opportunity to purchase the book out in the lobby and have it signed by the author. So I hope many of you take advantage of that. Professor Phillips Fein received her PhD in history from Columbia University. She presently is an associate professor at New York University's Gallatin School of Individualized Study, teaching courses such as American Capitalism, Contemporary Political Economy, History of the American Conservative Movement, among many others. Professor Phillips Fein just finished a 4-year term as contributing editor to Labor, Studies in Working Class History in the Americas, and is starting a term on the editorial board of the Journal of American History. She has published articles in Nation, London Review of Books, Journal of American History, and Journal of Policy History, just to name a few. Professor Phillips Fein is currently working on a new project under contract with Metropolitan Books about New York City in the 1970s and the fiscal challenges of those years. So now, you didn't come here to listen to me talk, so without further ado, please help me in welcoming Kim Phillips Fein.
Well, thank you so much to Miko for that introduction, and thank you to everybody for being here. I already expressed my gratitude to President Conklin and to the Handel family for sponsoring this lecture series. But it's great to, thanks for being here, and it's remarkable to be here near the home of FDR to be speaking and thinking about his history, although, as we were saying beforehand, in some ways it's actually quite appropriate, because this is probably one of the places in the country where Roosevelt was the least popular. So it's actually, it's nice to be here, and it's great to be here, and it's great to be here near the home of FDR. So as Professor Manor said, usually when we think of the legacy of the New Deal, we think about the New Deal itself and the tradition of a certain kind of liberalism that descends from it. And when I speak of liberalism here, I'm thinking of the specific tradition that seeks to redress the economic inequalities and to mitigate some of the harshnesses of a market economy. And surely, in many ways, the legacies of the New Deal are all around us. Anybody who has ever worked at a job paying a minimum wage, anyone who has belonged to a labor union, anyone who puts money in a bank account that is insured by the federal government, anyone who pays Social Security taxes and hopes to someday collect Social Security, all of these are legacies of the New Deal. But my subject today is a little bit different. I'm going to be talking about the ways that the New Deal also represents the moment of the invention of modern conservatism, and suggesting that the reaction against the New Deal, as much as its positive accomplishments, shapes the world that we live in today. And this, I think, raises another question. What do we mean by conservatism? What is conservatism? And I'm going to focus in particular for this talk on one strand of the conservative movement, particularly the role of business activism in American politics and business activism around economic issues. So I'm not really going to be talking as much about, say, the pro-life movement or the kind of the tradition of religious conservatism. I'm going to be thinking about the role, the kind of the economic aspect of the conservative movement, and the kind of resistance to programs and policies that encourage economic redistribution and regulation of the economy. And in some ways, this is a history that's very much with us today. In the wake of the 2010 Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court, the role of corporations and of the very wealthy in American politics has expanded to a whole new scale. In the 2012 election, each campaign raised about $1 billion, and outside spending groups raised an additional $834 million, with the majority of that $834 million coming in the form of very large donations of $1 million or more from about 159 people and groups. Christian Freeland, a reporter, wrote in The New Yorker about sleeper cells, that's what people called them, of hedge fund billionaires who were seeking to defeat President Obama. Sheldon Adelson, a casino mogul, got a lot of attention for the $92 million that he and his wife personally spent in the election season. The oil men Charles and David Koch spent about $33.5 million on anti-Obama attack ads. Now, much of this spending, of course, came to naught. I think not one single candidate that Sheldon Adelson, for example, supported actually won election. And in some ways, it was hard not to feel pleased on the day after the election, simply at the thought, wherever you stood politically, at the thought of all of these wealthy people for whom these vast sums are kind of a drop in the bucket, coming up empty-handed. But did they feel defeated? Did they feel depressed for long? No. On the contrary, the super PACs almost immediately transformed themselves into lobbying groups. And the New York Times has reported on the efforts of the same groups that tried to elect Republicans in the election season, lobbying against tax increases in the negotiations over the fiscal cliff. And on the other side of the aisle, President Obama also seems unlikely to cease the permanent campaign that defined his first term in office in a lot of ways. So I think that part of the lesson of the 2012 election is that when such large sums of money become part of politics, even when the candidates who that money goes to don't win office, the ability to spend that amount of money gets you listened to in a different way in Washington. And the massive political mobilization of business and the legitimizing of the idea that the very rich have the right to use their money to shape our political life has created very strong incentives for politicians on both sides of the aisle to cater to this business class. And part of the result is that the efforts of business people to shape the ideological landscape have a deep effect on what seems possible to the rest of us. So looking at this contemporary political scene, it may seem as though this state of affairs is inevitable and timeless, that it's simply the way things have always been. But while it is certainly true that business had long had a powerful voice in American politics, I suggest that this current wave and current iteration of business activism has a specific history that traces back to the 1930s and the New Deal, and to the legacy and to the institutions and ideas that were created during the New Deal, which were at the center of American politics for much of the 20th century. Many of the organizations, the ideas, and in some ways the basic framework for thinking about business and politics can be traced back to this moment, and to the efforts of business people to understand and grapple with the challenges that the New Deal created for them. The aggressive corporate activism of the present has its antecedents in this deep sense of anxiety and danger that some parts of the American business class, and I should say this was not universal among business people, but that some parts of the American business class have long felt regarding this kind of popular political mobilization. And while it may seem driven by self-interest, and in some ways it is, it's also, I think, linked to a deeper view of the world that these people held. And while it's connected to a sense of power and entitlement, it also has thrived and taken on new forms precisely when business people feel most under siege, either economically or politically insecure. And this embattled sense on the part of business that it's necessary to become politically active and to stand up for the rights of business in the political sphere has deep roots in American history going back to the New Deal. So I want to start this lecture by talking a bit about the 1930s and discussing the business campaigns of that time. And I'll also touch briefly, just to give you some sense of how historians have thought about conservatism and how thinking about its roots in the New Deal moment might make us see us a little bit differently. I will then move forward to talk a bit about the 1950s and briefly the 1970s and the kind of what happens after the New Deal and how these kinds of business organizing efforts take place throughout the rest of the 20th century. And I'll conclude with a few thoughts, just bringing us back to the present situation. So, thinking back to the 1930s, it was over the summer of 1934, the three brothers who ran the DuPont Chemical Corporation organized a series of meetings for business friends at various locations in New York City. They gathered at the General Motors offices near Columbus Circle, they met in the Empire State Building, and the small group was gathered together to discuss a matter of great importance, beginning what one of the DuPont brothers called a property holders association to talk about how to distribute, quote, information about the dangers to investors posed by the New Deal. The DuPonts were becoming highly disturbed about the direction the country was taking in the 1930s. Strikes were spreading across the country, and the Roosevelt administration was seeking to pass laws regulating the financial industry. And the family, which was one of the wealthiest in the nation at the time, was growing troubled. They objected to the Roosevelt administration's opposition to child labor, for example. As Pierre DuPont, the oldest of the three, put it, "No federal law or constitutional amendment will abolish child labor unless the parents in the community are convinced that child labor should not exist." So child labor is really a family matter. They were afraid of the massive strikes in Minneapolis, San Francisco, Toledo, Ohio. Abuse of the strike privilege, said Pierre, has become a national evil. And they feared that the Roosevelt administration was trampling on constitutional rights. The country, warned Irénée DuPont, was losing the freedom guaranteed by the Constitution, without which it would, quote, rapidly decline in civilization and happiness. So we usually think of the New Deal as the origin point for modern American liberalism. And we think of FDR as one of the best-loved American presidents, whose legislative accomplishments transformed life for working class and poor people. And there's kind of an iconic image of working class families having pictures of FDR hanging in their homes over the kitchen table. There's also ample evidence of people writing personal letters to the president and to Mrs. Roosevelt describing their lives and their problems and suggesting a very intimate connection that people felt and closeness to the Roosevelts, almost as though they were friends who might aid, who might help in the calamity of the Depression. The many achievements of the New Deal, everything from the creation of regulations for the financial and banking system, such as the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated investment from commercial banking to make banking more secure for people who are simply trying to place their deposits, the creation of federal deposit insurance, the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission that regulated what information companies seeking to sell their shares publicly had to disclose, to the labor laws that guaranteed working people the right to organize unions for the first time and created a mechanism for so doing, to the creation of Social Security and the first federal programs for women, children, and disabled people to be able to receive material aid, the first national minimum wage and hour laws, the public works programs that both employed millions of out-of-work Americans and also helped to develop the South and Southwest of this country economically to create an infrastructure where one had not existed. Beyond all of these specific accomplishments, the simple fact of the federal government taking some sort of responsibility to help people and provide them with support in the midst of the worst economic disaster of their lives and of the 20th century. All of these are rightly thought to have been, in some ways, deeply popular accomplishments. And this is true. The New Deal, in many ways, created what we have of a welfare state and of an idea of liberalism even today. And the programs and policies that were created at that time, in part with the support of Roosevelt, were beloved by many, but not by all. The 30s also saw a sharp reaction against Roosevelt, one that in many ways laid the groundwork for the conservative movement that gained strength later in the 20th century, which gave us Ronald Reagan and ultimately even in some ways George Bush, and even in certain ways the Tea Party movement traces its origins back to this time. Now, frequently, and in the historical profession, and I think you also see this in kind of writings of journalists and others about conservatism, people think of conservatism in terms of social issues. Many historians have suggested that the roots of the conservative movement are to be found in the reaction against the civil rights movement of the 1960s and what some see as the excesses and others as the achievements of feminism, gay rights, and the movement against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. And part of the idea is that ordinary working class and middle class people in the 60s and 70s who had previously been loyal New Deal Democrats were troubled by the cultural radicalism of the time and reacted by turning to the right and electing Reagan. And I think there's some truth to that story, but my work suggests a different dimension of the conservative movement. And I think seeing the origins of conservatism in the backlash against the New Deal helps first to emphasize the longevity of this movement, that it goes back much deeper in American history and isn't just a backlash against what happened in the 1960s. It also helps us to understand the centrality of economic issues to conservatism throughout the century and even today. And in many ways, the successes of conservatism have, I think, been especially clear in economic policies. Tax rates are much lower than they were in the 1950s. Labor unions today represent a smaller proportion of the workforce than they did in the 1920s. The welfare state and social safety net have been greatly eroded. And I think looking at the deep roots of conservatism around economic issues helps us to see why these questions about the economy are so contentious even now. Finally, it helps us to look at the role of wealthy elites in helping to shape American political history. Not in a conspiratorial sense, because they certainly weren't able to accomplish all of what they wanted, but it helps us to think about how it is that people with power come to exercise that, how it is built, how economic power relates to political power, instead of focusing only on working class or primarily on working class people. And finally, I think looking at this history helps us to see the New Deal differently, to see it as the fiercely contested political transformation that it in fact was. So the New Deal met with resistance from various different sources in the 1930s, from Southern legislators who, while also part of the Democratic Party, and FDR relied deeply on the support of politicians who represented the segregated South, nonetheless, later in the 30s, they began to become more deeply critical because they recognized the creation of a powerful central government that might threaten the states' rights regime that made possible Jim Crow. The New Deal was also criticized in the 30s by a range of different intellectuals who were critical of what they saw as a growing centralization of power, especially after the explosive developments early in FDR's second term around the Supreme Court, the court packing plan, and also the sit-down strikes of that time. But it also met with support from business people. And for certain parts of the American business scene, the New Deal appeared terribly dangerous. These were people who couldn't stand to speak Roosevelt's name, and so he was referred to as that man by a sort of generation of business conservatives. And even though Roosevelt was not ever interested in overthrowing capitalism and saw himself as, you know, in many ways shoring up capitalism from political dangers, for business people who were anxious about the economic future, it seemed as though he was a radical who was determined to undo the social and economic system on which they depended. And in truth, the economic order the New Deal helped to create did lead to a much more equal distribution of wealth. They were wrong to fear that he was a closet socialist, but they were not altogether wrong to imagine that their position within the country would undergo some change as a result of the New Deal. So why did American business people have this strong reaction against Roosevelt? Well, in part it is because there are few moments that saw a sharper transformation in the public image and perception of business than the onset of the Great Depression. The 1920s were a golden decade for American business. The fierce battles between labor and capital that had defined American politics in a lot of ways ever since the late 19th century seemed in the 1920s to have been decisively settled, with business dominant. The labor movement had represented about 20% of the workforce in 1920. That plummeted over the course of the 1920s till about by only half of the number before, only 10% of the nation's workers were in unions in 1930. The radical politics of the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Populist Party, anarchism, the socialism of the industrial workers of the world, and Eugene Debs, all of this nearly disappeared by the 20s as well. Business people were celebrated in the press and in the new media of radio. A new consumer economy and a mass consumer culture were coming into existence, although it's also worth remembering just how partial these were at this moment when many rural parts of the country in 1930 remained without electrical power. In many ways, the 1920s is a time very familiar to us. There was a stock market craze that had, even though the actual number of people in terms of the proportion of the country investing in the market was not that great, it was higher than it had been. And the idea of investing, the idea that through the stock market you could become quite rich with little work, kind of spread like wildfire and was highly publicized by the press as well. It was a time of new technology, of a wide range of new types of technology, and especially new communication technology. Just as in the 90s and afterwards, we've had a great surge of enthusiasm about the internet. In the 20s, you have a kind of passion about the radio, movies, and a sense of the ways in which this kind of technology is transforming society, and a great deal of excitement and enthusiasm about that and about the marketplace possibilities. As one visitor from Europe, I believe, to the United States, wrote about America in the 20s, America is an employer's paradise. So the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent economic depression, which, just to remind you, saw unemployment peaking at nearly 25% in 1932, much higher in many urban areas, comparing this to the recent recession in which unemployment topped out around 9%. So that profoundly changed the public perception of business. The basic prescription of American business people for the Depression was just to let it run its course, to wait until wages fell enough, until prices fell enough that investment would happen again naturally. As Richard Whitney of the Stock Exchange said, the fact that we have let nature take its course may augur well for the ultimate prosperity of the country. And for people who were losing their jobs and their homes, who were taking to the rails and living in Hoovervilles, little shanties and parks, standing on bread lines, such sentiments gave little comfort. In part because business leaders had been so celebrated in the 1920s, their absence of solutions for the Depression, and indeed their insistence that there could be no proactive solutions that would help, made them appear both foolish and self-interested. And for this reason, the Depression quickly became, for American business, as much a political crisis as an economic one. Shortly after his inauguration in 1933, Roosevelt sought to reach out to business. And there were quite a few prominent business leaders who were happy to see him come into office. The Hoover administration had been such a disaster that few were really sorry to see him go. The early initiatives of the Roosevelt administration won some business support, such as the National Recovery Administration, which lifted antitrust regulations so that businesses could cooperate to set prices within their industries, was something many found appealing. Now, the NRA quickly became very difficult in its day-to-day operations, and quickly its support among business waned pretty quickly. But in the beginning, people thought it might be promising. But even so, by the end, quite early, by the end of 1933 and early 1934, many business people like the DuPonts were alienated and anxious. And these businessmen sensed that the rise of the state and the whole idea that private industry could not really be trusted to get the economy thriving again, that this idea implicitly threatened their wealth and their power. And they engaged or began to engage in a variety of different activities to fight the New Deal. Now, to bring us back to the DuPonts and their meetings and their desire to found this Property Holders Association, this represents one type of activism that these business people were engaging in. The effort to jumpstart the creation of a populist campaign against the New Deal. The organization that the DuPonts helped to found was called the American Liberty League. And as its name suggests, the organization never presented itself as a business group. The brothers and their colleagues and friends with whom they started the organization felt that it would be better to actually distance their organization from too close association with business. They said people who were, quote unquote, above public reproach should be chosen to lead it, instead of the leaders of industry and finance who might appear motivated by self-interest. And the League also was careful. It did not initially define itself as an anti-Roosevelt group. It was supposed to be an organization that, in its rhetoric, would unite millions of people from all walks of life, workers and housewives and business people alike, in order to defend, quote, this is from one of their founding statements, the principles upon which our government was formulated. So it laid claim to be an expressly populist group that wasn't, and it tried to make it appear as though it wasn't going to just attack Roosevelt. But in fact, the Liberty League's main project was opposing the New Deal. There is no secret that one of the experiments is the endeavor to redistribute wealth. In fact, that is what the New Deal really means. Irénée DuPont wrote to the president of Eastman Kodak, who he was encouraging to join the group. In dozens of speeches and pamphlets, League members denounced the, quote, ravenous madness of the New Deal, arguing that the dragon teeth of class warfare are being sown with a vengeance, that the New Deal was leading to a totalitarian centralization of power, that it was hostile to businessmen who were seen as unscrupulous money changers, a reference to Roosevelt's famous first inaugural address, and that the New Deal was creating a bureaucracy that was spreading its tentacles over the business and private lives of the citizens of the country. Now, the League was also not exactly the broad-based populist movement that its leaders sought to portray. When the DuPonts were mobilizing, they reached out mostly to other executives and business people. They wanted to unite business in a campaign, and that is where the support for the group came from. In 1935, more than half of its funds came from less than 24 bankers, industrialists, and businessmen, and in 1936, about 30 people contributed a full 2/3 of the group's income. So despite the claim to be a really broad-based and grassroots kind of movement, the League was obviously dominated by the business people who had gotten the group started. The high point of League activity came in 1936, when the organization helped to support Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, who was also an oil executive, in his challenge to Roosevelt for the presidency. Although the Republican Party was actually very wary about being too closely associated with the League, League members contributed generously to Landon's campaign. And they also worked with the Republican Party to try to encourage employers to turn out their employees for Landon. Sterling Morton and executive Morton Salt wrote in one memo that the goal was to, quote, create a feeling of solidarity among the owners, managers, and executives, to make them feel that they are not alone in a fight against the New Deal, and to give them an opportunity to make their opposition effective by working with a political organization. The Republican Party took special aim at Social Security. The Industrial Committee, this division of the Republican Party that was working with business, distributed special pay envelopes to employers that had a warning printed on the front saying that employees would lose their money as the federal government collected a payroll tax, and that there was, quote, no guarantee that the money would ever come back to them. Workers would be reminded then, when they picked up their paychecks, how much smaller those checks would be once the payroll tax took effect. And none of it mattered in the end for 1936. The League actually became a rallying point for the Roosevelt campaign and for Roosevelt to denounce the business people who had opposed his New Deal. As he said in his famous campaign speech at Madison Square Garden, never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. Roosevelt won the election by a landslide. Landon did not even carry his home state of Kansas, and the Liberty League disbanded quietly not too long after that. The League was not the only business group to oppose Roosevelt in the 30s. There was also the National Association of Manufacturers. In contrast to the League, the National Association of Manufacturers was an explicitly business-oriented group and one that was dominated by large industrial companies in the 30s. After suffering a hit to its membership in the early years of the Depression, when companies couldn't afford the fees any longer, the NAM started to revive itself by insisting that it needed to aggressively defend the public image of business. The public does not understand industry, largely because industry itself has made no real effort to tell its story, to show the people of this country that our high living standards have risen almost altogether from the civilization which industrial activity has set up, said one NAM spokesman. NAM hired a public relations director and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a range of radio programs, movies, billboards, speakers, and paid advertisements, all of which were meant to rehabilitate the image of business in the Depression. And the thrust of many of the National Association of Manufacturers ads was to show class harmony and social mobility in America, with the suggestion being that Roosevelt was destroying these. For example, one advertisement depicted a construction worker on a steel beam who was waving down to a man below riding in a limousine, and the caption read, "I knew him when he pushed a wheelbarrow," suggesting that the construction worker and the man with the chauffeur had really come from the same common roots. The project was to sell free enterprise, as one National Association of Manufacturers publication put it. But even as it was funding this broad public relations campaign, the National Association of Manufacturers had another side, which was the fierce opposition to organized labor. Its legal department was at the forefront of the fight against the National Labor Relations Act, which gave workers the right to organize unions, and NAM lawyers encouraged their members to resist the law and wait for it to be overturned in court. Meanwhile, the group also publicized strike-breaking formulas, such as the Mohawk Valley formula, which was developed by the Rand Corporation, actually, in upstate New York. And it had little to say about major industrial corporations such as General Motors and Chrysler and Republic Steel, which stockpiled weaponry for potential use in conflicts with workers who wanted to organize unions. So just in case selling free enterprise did not work out, NAM wanted to make sure, or to try to make sure, that unions would not be able to tell their side of the story. This was another important element of business opposition to the New Deal during the 1930s. Finally, besides groups like NAM and the Liberty League, there were also individual business leaders who became politically aware during the 30s and then spent much of the rest of their lives and activities devoted to fighting liberalism. For example, Leonard Read was a young man working for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in California when he met William C. Mullendore, an executive at the Southern California Edison Company, a major utilities firm. Read was campaigning on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, trying to rally business support for the National Recovery Administration. Mullendore was already a fierce critic of the New Deal, giving speeches denouncing what he called the apostles of hatred in Washington, D.C. When he met Read, he was quickly able to win him over to his point of view, and Mullendore insisted there could be no compromise between capitalism and what he saw as the quasi-socialism of the New Deal. Quote, "We cannot have both systems. We must have one or the other." He told Read that it was his dream to, quote, mobilize a group of business leaders in this country who will start shouting from the housetops and the cellars and any other place we can gain a hearing that we are approaching disaster. A network of 1,000 executives who he thought could act as militant alarmists. And Reed went on to try to do exactly this. He turned the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce into a fiercely ideological advocate of free market ideas in the 30s, and in the post-war period, he came east to start a think tank, the Foundation for Economic Education, which is still around today, and it was based in Irvington, just a little bit south of here, that would distribute literature on free market thought to business people and others. Finally, it was during these years that many intellectuals developed the kinds of criticisms that would later become widespread in the fight against liberalism. In the United States, thinkers like Ayn Rand, who would later write The Fountainhead and then Atlas Shrugged, became politically engaged and active for the first time during the 30s, writing manifestos against Roosevelt. Albert J. Nock, who is now largely forgotten, was at the time a thinker who was well known for his denunciations of the growing centralization of state power. Austrian economist Friedrich von Hayek wrote his book, The Road to Serfdom, in the early 1940s in Great Britain. And The Road to Serfdom, which came up in the 2012 election when Paul Ryan claimed it as one of his inspirations, The Road to Serfdom argued that most forms of economic planning and expansion of state activity could be viewed as steps down a road to totalitarianism, and that even though liberals might mean well by regulating the economy, they were actually laying the groundwork for a totalitarian state, the very kind of language that we hear conservative activists using even today. So even though they were defeated at the time in the 1930s, I think the relationships that these intellectuals had with parts of the business community and their access to financial resources meant that their ideas would stay alive, that they could continue to be active, keep themselves organizing, and keep seeking to redefine the idea of freedom itself away from the economic liberalism advanced by Roosevelt and to change it to an idea of freedom organized around the free market. So that gives us some sense of the 1930s. I'm now going to speak a little bit about the 50s and then the 70s, and kind of to give you a sense of how this type of business organizing didn't end in the 30s but continued onwards. The political economy of the United States in the 1950s was very different from what it is today in ways that bore testament to the legacies of the New Deal. This was a time when the labor movement represented about a third of all workers, when the minimum wage was raised quite regularly. In the 1960s, when new major social programs like Medicare and Medicaid were created, making health care available to very poor and to elderly people. When the top tax rates in the 50s were about 90% and then 70% in the 1960s and 1970s. And these types of policies, accompanied by the economic growth and expansion of the era, did actually result in a kind of pattern of economic growth that was much more evenly distributed than it has been over the past couple of decades, when economic growth has also been accompanied by a widening division between the very rich and the very poor, and the stagnation of people in the middle. The Republican president of the time, during the 1950s, Dwight D. Eisenhower, actually, despite being a Republican, was a very different kind of Republican. He insisted that his party needed to redefine its beliefs, and that being seen as a political party opposed to the expanded federal government and the labor unions created during the New Deal was actually suicidal. As he wrote to his brother, who was actually a more traditional conservative, trying to convince him to change his views, he wrote to his brother, "Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor unions and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history." But even at this time, business opponents of the welfare state and of organized labor did not cease to do what they could within the constraints they faced to undermine the labor union movement and the ideals of the New Deal. There was actually a wave of interest in the late 1950s, during a recession in the late 1950s. There was a wave of interest among business people in finding ways to become more active in politics. One side of this was a new interest in union-busting strategies. The National Association of Manufacturers began to hold management training sessions, instructing employers on the kinds of strategies they could use to fight organizing drives. And the first anti-union consultants, kind of professionals who companies can call in to advise them on such strategies, began their work then, such as Nathaniel Schefferman, who had been a labor relations consultant at Sears before setting up his own independent practice. The number of unfair labor practices or kind of violations of the law that employers commit during union organizing drives, like threatening workers or firing people for organizing a union, these began to rise sharply in the late 1950s, and the proportion of union victories in elections began to fall. But the other side of this offensive in the 1950s was political. In the fall of 1958, Fortune magazine published an essay arguing that, quote, "The American corporation has rediscovered politics." The president of Gulf Oil said, "Whether we want to be there or not, Gulf and every other American corporation is up to its ears in politics, and we must either start swimming or drown." Companies began to organize workshops and seminar series on political action, instructing managers on how to run for political office, how to do door-to-door campaigning, how to organize a precinct. Company publications began to focus on political issues. One manager of public affairs at General Electric published a book called The Businessman's Guide to Practical Politics, which made the case that business people needed to get involved in fighting what the author referred to as a tightly organized and highly centralized group of organized labor leaders whose basic objective of collective bargaining has now become a secondary function, replaced by a new objective of seizing political power and ultimately control of government. It wasn't a coincidence that General Electric was so involved in this. GE was really at the forefront of these efforts under the leadership of a man named Lemuel Ricketts Boulware, its vice president of human relations. Boulware tried to turn General Electric into something that resembled an enormous think tank committed to free market economic ideas. He urged GE's managers to regularly read the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal, which was conservative then as it is today, National Review, which was a new magazine at the time, and other conservative publications. Each supervisor at the company received a copy of The Road Ahead, a short book that portrayed the New Deal as the first step down the road to dictatorship. GE supervisors were encouraged to hold reading groups and study sessions at their homes in the off hours, while workers were expected to go to classes on company time on the basic principles of free market economics. Boulware supported the relocation of General Electric factories from northern cities where they were unionized to southern states with right-to-work laws such as Arizona. And Boulware was motivated in his confidence, in his sense that business needed to take a stronger political role. The really critical public relations problem is now almost purely a political one, Boulware told his business audiences. He would go out and speak to groups of business people, trying to convince them to take part in these kinds of political projects. As he put it, no one else seems to be willing to go through the agony of trying to put what is right and what we instinctively know is right into language that is intelligible and convincing to the great mass of citizens who at the moment are being lied to by their government and by their unions. Businessmen, he said, must literally be born again in their fight for the free market. The most famous activist to be trained at GE during this period was Ronald Reagan, who began at GE as a corporate spokesman and traveled the country giving speeches to audiences of GE factory workers, and whose own political ideas also underwent a real evolution over his years at GE. In later years, Reagan and Boulware would keep in touch. When Reagan was in the White House, he sent Boulware 2 autographed golf balls for his birthday, for example, along with a message saying, "Dear Lem, in case I do something wrong, hit one of these with a 9-iron or a wedge and I'll feel it." Boulware wrote back saying, "Here's to your creative and courageous program of correction, continuing to live up to its great promise for you and all the rest of us." So despite the efforts of Boulware, though, much of the corporate community did not organize around a politics of opposition to the New Deal or to liberalism in the 50s or 60s. In the 70s, however, there is a sharp change. This is in part a response to the economic turmoil of the era and the slowdown in economic growth the high inflation and relatively high unemployment of the 1970s and the difficulties that business people had earning profits at that time. But it also reflected a wide sense of anxiety among business people thanks to the New Left and to new environmental and health and safety regulations that were passed early in the 70s. There was great anxiety in the business world about the hostility of young people to business, which the CEO and chairman of PepsiCo spoke about in one speech, saying that young Americans today were deeply hostile to corporations. Black and Decker warned stockholders in 1975 that the hour is getting late. It is time for the voices of those individuals favoring fiscal responsibility in government and a free business system to be heard. Robert Bork, law professor, told the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, board of trustees, business leaders will have to decide whether they are really willing to let the corporate system slide and perhaps expire without putting up a determined fight. And in the famous 1971 Powell Memorandum, written by lawyer Lewis Powell for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, shortly before being nominated by Nixon to serve on the Supreme Court, Powell, who was a prominent lawyer in Richmond, Virginia, warned of a growing attack on free enterprise and called on business to take political action. Political power, he wrote, is necessary. Such power should be assiduously cultivated. It must be used aggressively and with determination, and there should not be the slightest hesitation to press vigorously in all political arenas for support of the enterprise system. So all of this leads to a new wave of business organizing in the 70s. The expansion of think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, which was founded in the early 1940s, the creation of new ones such as the Heritage Foundation. Major new business organizations also get their start then, such as the Business Roundtable, which sought to limit its membership to the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And the Roundtable, at first, well, one consultant kind of described its project as developing a total attack program for business. There were some thoughts of trying to create a sort of Sesame Street style to teach television program to teach ideas about economics to young people, to, quote, accomplish the kind of reorientation of attitudes which preservation of the free enterprise system demands. This never went anywhere, and even though the Roundtable did fund some broad public campaigns, like a series in Reader's Digest, that were kind of these paid advertisements that took a very philosophical tone and sought to defend the idea of profit, for example, the Roundtable became much more influential as a lobbying force. For example, when legislation that might have made it easier for workers to organize unions came before Congress in 1978, the Roundtable deluged members of the Senate with communications against the law. And when one senator from Florida said he had heard more from the big kind of executives of big corporations than he had from small business people, as if by magic, his office was filled with entrepreneurs who had been flown to Washington in the Lear jets of their corporate brethren. The Chamber of Commerce, responding in part to Powell's suggestions, also expanded its efforts in the 1970s, building a major network of congressional action committees linking business people in particular districts with their congressional representatives. And this wave of business organizing also meant the first wave of corporate political action committees, which pool money in a company and enabling it to make donations to political campaigns. The law changed to permit corporations to create such organizations and to fund elections in this way in the early 1970s. But even after the law changed, it didn't just happen. Political education was required. Business activists held meetings attended by hundreds of others who were interested in learning how to bring their companies into politics. And at one such 1978 meeting in Boston, for example, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was then the former director of the CIA, said that he feared that the, quote, business of America seems to be the regulation of business, and that business needed to do more to elect politicians whose natural inclination is to reduce government. They needed, he said, to move heaven and earth to change control of the White House in the next election. Justin Durt, who was the chairman of the board of Dart Industries, a pharmaceutical conglomerate, who was also known as the Johnny Appleseed of the corporate PAC movement, got up to admonish the audience, saying, a company that doesn't have a political action committee is either apathetic, unintelligent, or you've got a death wish. He rejected the idea that corporate PACs were disrupting the political process, saying, I don't advocate that business buy a legislator. Rhetoric is a very fine thing. A little money to go with the rhetoric is better. They listen better. And sure enough, the number of corporate PACs swelled from 89 in 1974 to 821 in 1978, compared to only 250 for labor unions at the same time. As the New York Times put it, these are the days of wine and roses, or champagne even, and orchids, for business interests in Washington. So in some ways, this wave of activism culminates in the 1980 election campaign, although Reagan himself received kind of ambivalent support from the business community early in the election season. By the end of it, he was clearly the favored candidate of business. And I think the politics of what happens with business organizing in the 1980s and afterwards is complicated, but I think from this we can see a long history and a long pattern of business mobilizing in American politics around these kinds of economic issues. Today we see it in the activism of the Koch brothers, the formation of super PACs for both Democrats and Republicans, the mobilization of far-right executives on the one hand, and those still closer to the mainstream who nonetheless firmly oppose the passage of laws making it easier for labor to organize, to winning the extension of tax cuts, and refusing or being reluctant to fund the public sector such that it's now straining and many public services are being curtailed. So the business activism in support of the idea of the free market and critical of the welfare state and liberalism and labor unions, the kind of legacy of the New Deal, the business activism critical of these helped to strengthen conservative opposition to liberalism throughout the 20th century. It didn't create this alone, and conservative politicians were able to win electoral victories for a wide variety of reasons. And policies that are aimed at deregulation were able to win support from many people who were not conservative activists. But nonetheless, the steady financial support and clear ideological opposition that some parts of the business community gave to this movement have had, I think, a very significant political impact on the debate throughout the 20th century. We know, thanks to the work of economists such as Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, that the incomes of the very rich did fall in the middle years of the 20th century after the New Deal and World War II, and in recent years, as the conservative movement has gained power in Washington, they have risen again dramatically. As economist Joseph Stiglitz has argued, has shown the upper 1% of Americans are now receiving about 25% of the country's income each year, controlling about 40% of its wealth. 25 years ago, it was about 12% and 33%, respectively. And meanwhile, the proportion of the workforce belonging to a labor union is lower now than it has been since before World War I. So while this kind of increase in inequality has various sources, I think it is partly connected to the kinds of policies that have been implemented to roll back parts of the New Deal, the very kinds of policies that the business opponents of the New Deal promoted back in the 1930s. So just a few final words bringing us up to the present. I think today, in the wake of last year's presidential election, the Republican Party may seem in a kind of free fall. There's been a lot of reporting on the myriad divisions that are breaking out between big business and hardcore Tea Party activists and their leaders, and there have been some calls within the Republican Party to redefine itself in terms of social mobility. The idea is the governor of Louisiana has put it that we've got to make sure that we're not the party of big business, big banks, big Wall Street bailouts, big corporate loopholes, big anything. We cannot be, we must not be the party that simply protects the rich so they get to keep their toys. Yet, it's very difficult for conservatives to really shed this image and this kind of relationship. And I think it's also, it's unlikely that conservatism will really disappear, if only because the financial support for it is protean and able to help it survive such short-term setbacks. We see the descendants of the opponents of the New Deal in the passage of right-to-work legislation in Michigan. We see it in the concept of public life that focuses on the debt while obscuring many of the real problems of our time, and even in the kinds of concessions that the Democrats are currently making regarding Social Security and the kind of concessions that have been made to the right on the part of the Democratic Party today. So this history of business organizing, I think, is in some ways difficult to remember and challenging, especially for people who work at or study at public institutions, and to people who would like to see a revival of at least some of the commitments to economic justice represented by the New Deal. But I think it's important to recall this history because the hostility of the very rich to ideas of social justice and to greater equality, I think it's important to remember that not just because it helps us to think about the context for the conservative movement. It also matters on its own terms because it helps us to see the New Deal and to some extent the whole post-war economy in a different way. The New Deal was not a moment of national consensus. On the contrary, it brought out fierce social antagonisms, and the intense hostility with which its policies were met suggests something about the difficulty of winning social reforms in the United States. In a lot of ways, it was only really possible to create the New Deal at a moment of dramatic economic collapse, in a context in which capitalism did not appear the only viable way to organize economic life. And recognizing the resistance to the New Deal reminds us just how radical many of its central principles really were, how difficult it was to achieve them, even in a limited form. So for people who would like to see a resurgence of some kind of movement for economic democracy, this should not be cause for despair. Rather, it should be a reminder that obstacles to such a movement are great, but nonetheless that they have been transcended in the past and can be again. So I think I'll stop there and open up for questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Now we'll have questions, and just raise your hand and someone with a microphone will come to you. Please make your questions a question with only as much explanation as needed to help her understand what you're asking. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you think big business and labor interests can ever coalesce or will ever coalesce? Or is it a push and pull?
An absolute opposition? Well, I think that's a great question. And, you know, I think that I'm of two minds about this question. I think there's nothing inherent in, there's no reason that, and there are plenty of examples of companies that have been able to arrive at very good relationships with their unions. Many examples of public institutions, for example, that have had very positive relationships with the labor unions representing their workers. Many companies that were, you know, for many years, General Motors, for example, had a very, you know, had a positive negotiating relationship with the union, with the United Auto Workers. So there's nothing, I think that there's nothing that makes this impossible on the face of it. A labor union, you know, ideally brings together the interests of workers and provides a mechanism for communication between employees and their management. Without that mechanism, there can be, you know, tremendous tension. So in some ways, and I think people who promoted the labor movement or in the 30s and afterwards made the case that unions were actually good for business. They were good for social peace because they provided a way for workers and their employers to speak to each other that otherwise didn't really exist. At the same time, I also think that there is, I think it's not surprising that this tension emerges because I think there is, I mean, especially for private companies, it's a little bit different in the public sector. There is a way in which really recognizing the right of the union to exist, and it is a limit on the power of the company and on the power, on the power of management. And I think that many managers find that difficult to cope with. And that's and partly this comes out of the imperative of kind of accelerating and maximizing profits. But it also comes maybe out of other, a cultural sense of who the employees are and a certain lack of respect. So I guess I would say I don't think it's inherently the case. There are many. Also, I would point to many other countries have strong, stable labor movements in which don't seem as fraught with conflict as the American one has been in recent years. So there's nothing inherent, but nonetheless, I think there are strong tendencies, and perhaps especially in the American context, that can make these relationships very heavily contested.
Hello.
Hi.
Regarding the conservative movement, with 1968, had Robert Kennedy not been assassinated, he would have probably been president. Where would this country be economically? Where would the conservative movement be today? For that matter, if Martin Luther King was assassinated
Right.
also, where would things be as far as the conservative movement today, do you think?
Well, that's a great question also, and I think historians, counterfactual questions are hard for historians to deal with. I think that it actually, one thing that I think the one tricky thing about this history is that something really does change in the 1970s that I'm not sure Kennedy or King or anybody else would have exactly been able to address, which is I think the American economy starts to undergo this shift and transformation over the 1970s. And there is a politics to this. It's the deindustrialization and the movement of industry outside of these heavily unionized centers to both the southern United States and then ultimately out of the country altogether. And the rise of the service industries creates a very different social basis for these ideologies to operate in. And I guess the question is whether a different group of political leaders would have had a very different set of responses to these. And I think they might have had not just had these leaders not been assassinated, but had the political movements that they worked with and stood for been able to grow, it could have promoted a different set of solutions to the economic problems of the 70s. As it was, the conservative response to the economic problems of the 70s was much more coherent in a lot of ways than the liberal one. And there was no kind of revitalization of liberal ideas in the 70s that could provide a different approach to the problems the country was facing. So I guess I would say one more thing, which is I think it's hard, today I think we think about leaders like King and Kennedy and also think of them as having, especially Martin Luther King, having this very universal appeal. But at the time, they were really polarizing figures that were, and there was already a vast, there was already a strong reaction to the leftism of the 60s taking shape at the time. So it's just interesting. I think could things have, conflicts might have been even more intense. Anyway, I think it's counterfactual questions are hard to deal with, but it's an interesting hypothetical.
Hello. Couldn't you consider big unions as a form of big business that markets labor? Mm-hmm. And maybe that's why there's this antagonism between them. It's two competing businesses.
Well, I think that is a vision of unions that a lot of people have, and I think that it's. But I think there is something different about business and unions, and that unions aren't just kind of marketing or seeking a price for labor, they are also trying to provide some kind of democratic mechanism whereby people can, and not just help influence what their wages will be, but also affect their working conditions in a variety of different kinds of ways. So I guess I think there's something that unions are not just another form of business. They are actually a different kind of social organization.
The wedge between the very wealthy, the middle class, and the poor is unfortunately just growing, it seems, in leaps and bounds these days. I was just wondering if you see anything on the horizon to halt that, or any reason for us to have hope that it can kind of revert to where it was?
Right. I think that there is actually, I actually think that there is now a political conversation about economic inequality in a way that there really wasn't 2 years ago, say, and I think that is actually the beginning of a possible solution. I mean, I think that the widening inequality, again, as a historian, you know, I think I don't kind of recommend policies exactly, but I think it is clear that I do think that certain kinds of policies could actually promote greater equality, and that it's actually not altogether mysterious what some of these might be. But I think I think that the first step is creating greater public awareness and greater political mobilizing around these questions. And I think that the Occupy Wall Street moment, for all of its, all the critiques that can be made of it, it actually did help bring these issues into political conversation in a way that they had really been absent from before. I actually think that the Obama campaign owes a great deal to that mobilization, and that it, was able to really build on those themes to be successful last November. So I think that is, I think that the kind of popular political mobilizing, educating, and organizing is really what changes things, and that if people want to see a different kind of country, that kind of conversation is where things have to begin. And I do feel more optimistic than I did a few years ago, in part because I think these issues really are talked about now, and that there is starting to be awareness around them in a way that they had really been absent for some time before that.
Given that optimism, and with the economy fluctuating up and down in past years, do you foresee things stabilizing in the near future, and if not, how long?
I wish I could say. I think another interesting difference about the economy today from this kind of post-New Deal moment is the much greater level of uncertainty and the recurrence of economic panics, fluctuations, and crashes as compared to the middle years of the 20th century. And I think about this actually often with students, that I feel that many students, and people can correct me if you have a different experience, many students have a kind of a set of assumptions or ideas about attaining a middle-class life that seem very formed by the experience of the mid-20th century. A set of assumptions about economic stability, about their own economic progress, and I think there is something really different. I mean, the recessions today are much more frequent, more prolonged, and also more accompanied by these kind of wild gyrations of the financial markets than they were in the mid-20th century. In a way, I think people's ideas and expectations about their lives are at odds with what their actual economic experiences are. I would say I don't see anything in the current moment that would lead to, I can't really say the end of the recession or I don't see a policy framework coming into existence that would create a more stable, a revival of that somewhat more stable economy of the post-war years. But I do think that there is something about the tension between what people expect and want from their own lives and what the reality of their experiences is that I think can, again, spark something of a political conversation that can help to take things in a different direction. So again, not exactly. Hard to say about I wish I had a better sense of kind of the immediate future, but I do think that gap between expectations and reality in the past is often what provokes political movements, and I think you can imagine something like that happening again today. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the great questions, too.